Okay, well, good morning, everyone. The key issue in terms of implementing the Coalition's fiscal austerity package over the next few years is going to be whether they can hold the line on spending. Unfortunately, the lesson of history is that it is far easier for governments to increase spending than it is to hold the line, let alone reduce spending. But this is going to be absolutely critical to whether the government can deliver over the next few years. So I'm going to look at the figures from yesterday in that light. And the problem always is, in these circumstances, that government's plans get hit by these dreaded events. So the event we've had this time is that if we look out over the forecast period, we can see that borrowing has increased by around 46 billion over the whole period, all of which is attributable to an increase in spending. So straight away, with the first budget post setting out the plan, there is reason to feel concerned. This whole overrun on borrowing has been driven by spending. And there are three particular areas that we can highlight that are shown in the report. And they're pretty familiar, probably to everyone sitting in this room. First of all, we've got higher spending on social security and tax credits. Second, we've got public sector pensions have increased, these unfunded public sector pensions. And third, debt interest has gone up. Now, there are a variety of things, and the OBR's report is actually very, very helpful in explaining what has driven this. But there's one factor above all others that has already been mentioned, and that is inflation. Inflation has turned out to be higher, and that has driven all three of these areas up in terms of spending. Now, there is a kind of general view, and I've expressed this view many times in the past myself, that inflation is actually good for governments in fiscal difficulties because you get this inflation tax which drives down the real value of their debt, and it makes it easier to fund things as you're going along. The problem here is that we seem to have had the wrong kind of inflation, because what we've had is inflation that a lot of it has come from overseas, a lot of it reflects weakening in sterling. We've seen price levels driven up, which through the forecast period drives up those elements of spending that are directly linked to CPI now. Things like pensions, in particular, have been pushed up by the fact that we've had higher inflation. The OBR has increased the inflation forecast through the period, and we've now got that triple lock on state pensions as well, which means that once you've locked it in, once you've got it, you lock it in for the future. So that's driven up spending, higher inflation. Now, normally, you would expect there to be an offsetting effect on the revenue side because earnings are also lifted because you get this higher inflation, higher earnings, higher tax revenues. That hasn't really happened because earnings, of course, are lagging behind inflation. So we've taken a hit on the spending side, but we haven't really had the offset on the revenue side, hence the higher borrowing. Now let's focus in on debt interest. As has already been mentioned, the gilt market has been incredibly forgiving so far of the fiscal position, and also the increase in inflation. This chart shows the gilt yield on 10-year gilts, tracking along there the blue line, versus the annual inflation rate on the CPI measure. And as we can see, and as has already been mentioned, the gap has more than closed. Inflation is now running higher than short and medium-term gilt yields. Can that last? How long is the gilt market going to be prepared to accept the government's plans on trust? It's a very important question, and unfortunately there is no way of precisely answering it. But we do know, as has already been said, that in the past we've had much higher yields. Back in the 70s, those of us old enough to remember that, can recall gilt yields that were well in excess of 15%, which is a very scary thought. And if we look overseas, of course, we can see these countries where there is not the same market confidence in the fiscal position, where we have got yields on government bonds 10 years, 2, 4, even 9 percentage points higher than we are. So there's clearly quite a lot of scope for these yields to increase. How much of an impact would that have? Well, the OBR has some useful ready reckoner figures on this, and they say that 1 percentage point on current level of yields, that is the baseline level of yields, and they are allowing already for some modest increase in yields through the period, would add around 6 billion per annum to debt servicing costs by the end of the forecast period. So there's quite a lot of damage that could be done by higher yields if the markets lose confidence. And the other important point to remember is something we've talked about in these briefing sessions before, which is that the debt interest that we pay on the official national debt understates what is really the cost of servicing our real national debt, which includes a number of off-balance sheet items as well as the official gilt issues. And what this chart shows is the interest payments on the official national debt, in green there, going up to around 66 billion per annum from the OBR forecast. And we're comparing that with what we're calling the debt servicing costs on the real national debt that include the costs of payments on unfunded state pensions and unfunded public sector pensions and also PFI contracts. And as you can see, that goes up to around 200 billion per annum. And so, you know, that we've got a fast mounting burden of debt service ahead of us. Now, what are the lessons from all this? There are two key points, because I think I've run out of time. The first one is that the government must stick to its guns. There can be no question of relaxing its policy of keeping a tight clamp on spending, because if the markets get a whiff of that, we're going to see the gilt yields jacking up considerably. The second thing is that the government needs to review, and I think there's already some work going on this, its fiscal framework, and think about how it is going to incorporate some way of setting limits on spending in the medium term. Remember, there were those two fiscal rules that Gordon Brown had, and people talked a lot about the third rule, a spending rule. The government needs to think about how it's going to incorporate that. Thank you.